everyone, this is the Retro Tech Dad here. So while I continue working on my Red Magic 8 Pro video, I thought it would be interesting to check back in with the Logitech G Cloud and see how things stand with the device about 4 months after it launched in North America. I will cover the recent update and 2 viewer requests that have come up repeatedly, which is doing a teardown of the device and taking a look at the D-pad. Okay, so right off the bat, this is still only available in the US, so unfortunately nothing has changed on that front. Now Logitech actually rolled out an update of significance on January 31st, and so I decided to check back in now that my device received the update notification, and this is certainly a worthy one. The latest update, which is version SQ02K.00.0080, received some new features, one of which is the virtual button mapping, one of the areas that I criticized the G Cloud for lacking back in October when I published my review of the device. Personally, I am very excited about this update because it means we can properly play games like Call of Duty Mobile and Genshin Impact on it. So let's quickly roll this update to the device and check out how the new feature works on the G Cloud. Okay, so here we are in these settings, so let's poke around here a little. So one feature that is part of this recent update is the ability to adjust the sensitivities of both analog sticks. Now, I'm perfectly content with how it's set up by default, but I will have to see how it affects gameplay. It looks like there are 5 settings in total. We have the default, delay, instant, high performance, and smooth. So starting with delay, we can see how it's set up with the graph below. Here's the instant setting. Next we have high performance, and finally the smooth setting. I'll leave it at default for now, and the same tweaks can be made to the right joystick. Okay, let's back out and head over to the labs section where we can enable the experimental virtual button mapping feature. Okay, let's enable this, and so to use this feature, you will start the game first and then press and hold the home button until the quick settings menu pops up, and from there you can make all the adjustments. Alright, let's quickly check what else is here and then head over into our first game. Naturally, we're gonna go with some Genshin Impact, and as you can see, this game does not have native controller support on Android. So pressing the home button and holding it down until the quick settings screen comes up, and from here we can configure the key mapping. Let's enable the key mapping feature and then click on configure key map. So it looks like we have every mappable button available to us on screen from the start. It's a different approach compared to gamepad mappers that we've seen on devices like the Odin Pro or Retroid Pocket 3. So we can manipulate all of the icons and move them around to our preferred placement. It looks like all of them are disabled by default, which makes sense, and you can turn on the ones you want to configure as needed. Alright, so let me move a few things around and quickly set a few of these so that I can test how they perform in game. Okay, one thing you might have noticed on screen is the option to set analog sticks to hold or repeat mode. As the on-screen explanation demonstrates, the hold feature is going to be set up more like a traditional movement on an analog stick, whereas repeat will mimic swiping on the touchscreen. For Genshin Impact, we will definitely want the repeat setting disabled. The hold option also lets you resize the analog stick, and for Genshin Impact, I recommend sizing it so that it covers the on-screen joypad controls to match the sizing for the best performance. And yep, after some tweaking, this feels really great, and it's such a joy to be able to finally play Genshin on this comfy device with this great screen. It was a real bummer for me when I found out that the G Cloud had no gamepad mapping initially, as many might not be aware, but the G Cloud has no issues running the game with that Snapdragon 720G. Okay, let's move on to Call of Duty Mobile as my next game for demonstration. So I do apologize in advance to the players in that match, since I was basically not participating as I spent time tweaking the controls to my liking, for the most part at least. So I will quickly speed through this and get to the next match where I can actually start using some of the gamepad mapping I set up. So for Call of Duty, I set the left analog stick to hold, and for whatever reason, the right analog stick worked correctly with the repeat setting on. I guess this has to do with how Call of Duty registers the inputs on screen. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe someone can chime in about it down in the comments. Anyways, here's a little gameplay of Call of Duty, and it's definitely a joy to be able to play with the built-in controls of the G Cloud. After playing a match, there were a few things I wanted to tweak, and it made me think that it would be nice to have a future update where we could download pre-configured setups for these specific games.
Heads up, enemy UAV spotted. Enemy contact. Winning this one. Enemy down.
time to grab one of my iFixit kits and give the G Cloud a proper teardown, which I didn't do at the time of publishing my review back in October. To be honest, this is something I've only recently started doing in some of my in-depth videos, and I've received a lot of positive feedback regarding that, so I will try my best to include this in as many of my in-depth videos as I can. Anyways, this was specifically a viewer request to have the G Cloud disassembly video. The G Cloud is a little interesting is that there might not be any apparent place to start with a teardown. There are no visible screws, and it does have a very clean design, which makes it a little difficult to get into. Tracing along some of the seams, none of them stand out to me as being an obvious place to take apart. It's got weird curves that definitely become much more obvious after the disassembly. The bottom doesn't have a seam at all, so it's not like it splits open in a two-piece shell commonly found in many handhelds. So at first I'm thinking to myself that maybe the top of the shell is a good entry point for the G Cloud. I usually like to work around these shoulder buttons as there is enough separation in the shell to get a tool in there to begin some type of separation. However, after poking around, getting the top portion slightly separated, it became apparent that this would not be the way to go, and there was obviously something keeping the back top piece connected. So for anyone that is attempting a disassembly, this is not the way to start. The appropriate attack point is through the textured grips on the back of the G Cloud. I found that going in the corner of the grips, you can get a pry tool in there to give it some separation and lift to then be able to pop out these grips. They will require a good amount of force as they are held in by several clips. You can definitely hear them when I remove it. It's not a pleasant process, and you will want the thinnest tool you can find to get in that corner to get the leverage you need. Once both grips have been removed, we are now finding the secrets to the design and 4 standard screws on each side of the device. Quickly removing these, and Logitech very nicely buried 1 screw on each side in a very narrow and long path, so you will need a screwdriver that can reach down into there. Personally, I made do and worked with what I had to get this undone because I'm a little impatient. It was also during this time that I figured out that the device was causing injuries to me, so this is a good reminder to all to practice safety first. With all of the screws off, we are now ready to get this back plate off, and for this I had to get a pry tool in through the front of the device at the seam where the grips are. With enough force, the back plate will come off. Again, this is held in place with several clips. Alright, with that off, we are still not quite there with exposing the internals. Keep in mind that all of this is done in an effort to make the Logitech aesthetically pleasing, and I imagine this also helps with its substantial build quality. On the next back plate, we have 6 additional screws that we need to remove, and hopefully this will be the final layer until we get to the motherboard reveal. Quickly removing these screws, one note I'd like to make is that the 6th screw is hiding away by the left trigger button. So with that final screw removed, this next plate comes off pretty easily. We have finally made it to the internal components. Here we can see the pretty substantial 6000 mAh battery that definitely contributes to the G Cloud's pretty stellar battery performance. Quickly looking around, and things look pretty nicely assembled here. Not too surprised by that, honestly. Now that I have a good understanding of how the shell comes together in the G Cloud, a potential battery replacement wouldn't be the worst thing that I've seen. So while we are at this point of disassembly, I want to take a look at the D-pad and see how it is set up along with the membrane that it is using, and maybe try to improve on it. This is another viewer request, and so in order to access the D-pad, we will need to remove the daughter board on the left side. There are 4 ribbon cables connected to this daughter board, and they are fairly fragile to remove. Again, proceed with caution as you will need to move slowly, carefully, and be patient with the process. Before dealing with the ribbon cables, there are a few screws that need to be removed, and the left trigger will also need to be removed to access the entirety of the daughter board. Let's quickly remove the 3 visible screws first. Then, let's take care of the ribbon cable that connects the daughter board to the analog stick. This is by far one of the more fragile cables. We need to carefully remove the Kapton tape to expose the actual connector. Lift the black tab to allow the cable to easily be removed from its connection. Okay, let's move to the next ribbon cable. This one is a little more substantial, but the connection tab is very delicate, so carefully lift it up so that the cable can be released. Now we are able to remove the 4th screw. The next thing we will want to do is remove the shoulder trigger from the device. This is held in place by 2 screws. Okay, with that out of the way, we can continue with the removal process. Let's remove the next screw on the daughter board itself. So we are not quite done yet, as we have 2 additional cables to remove. These next 2 are pretty tiny and again very fragile, so carefully lift the black tabs and slowly release the cable from the connection. So you can see that we still can't quite free the daughter board from the shell. We will have to remove the analog stick, which is held in place by 2 screws. Let's quickly remove those screws. By the way, one of them is concealed beneath that tape. Alright, now we can finally get this board out of the shell and reveal the back of the D-pad. Let's take a look at the membrane being used here. I think part of the problem with the D-pad is that it's quite mushy and you don't get enough travel to make it feel like you're pressing down in a certain direction. The membrane is very soft and doesn't really have much resistance and not quite as springy as some others I've seen before. The D-pad itself is unfortunately a unique shape to the G Cloud and it's a little tricky to find something that could go in its place. There are a few ideas to potentially make the D-pad feel better. One is using a thin layer of plastic like something from the lid of a Pringles container, which is an old Xbox 360 D-pad hack. So I had a Betty Crocker lid from some random jar of frosting that is probably expired by now, so I decided to cut a piece of that lid to place over the D-pad to see if it helped any, and long story short, I didn't care for it. The next idea I had was to place some folded double-sided tape in the center to help it pivot better, and again, didn't really give me the improvements I wanted from the D-pad. My last idea was to repurpose an old membrane I had from a broken 8-bit DOE controller, which has a much more solid and stiffer membrane, so tracing it out to place inside the well of the D-pad and putting it back in place. I did a quick test, but let me show you how it looks when fully reassembled, and yeah, this was my favorite approach to give the D-pad a little more bounce and responsiveness. I think if you can add a full-size D-pad membrane, like a replacement part used for a SNES controller, it makes the D-pad feel a little less mushy. This is by no means meant to be a fix for this D-pad, and unfortunately it's just one of those things that you either like or don't. A lot of the parts in the G Cloud do not appear to be standard fit, so you do have to experiment with it. If you have any ideas, let me know down in the comments. I'm more than happy to dig into the device again to mess around. So overall, how do I feel about the Logitech G Cloud after 4 months of owning it? I have to say that despite its mixed reception, I am actually a fan of the G Cloud. I went to a wedding down in Miami and took it with me for that trip as my only handheld. I think it has standout build quality and a fantastic large screen which makes gaming an absolute joy. My opinion mostly stays the same from a few months ago, and I do think it is still overpriced at its current going rate of $299. But I have seen it hit that $250 price point, and as more secondhand units appear, I think it's a solid value at around $200. Again, it's got some of the best build quality I've seen in the handheld segment, and outside of its average D-pad, all of the other controls are quite nice. The controller mapping is a nice and much needed feature, one of which really should have been available at launch or closer to it. However, I do appreciate that Logitech still remembers that this device exists and seems to be rolling out updates for it. So again, my recommendation is mostly the same, and if you are still interested in the device, just keep an eye out for deals and sales. As always, this is the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.